All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been coming at you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The textbook used for this class, amongst others for me, will be ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Lee Naylor. I am first going over probably what did we say here? 12 out of the 17, so about 70% of this textbook right here. Professional ASP.NET MVC 5 by John Galloway of Microsoft and others. I am in Chapter 9, the routing chapter, and in particular, I'm about to come in and start talking about defining traditional routes. So the author says here, before you created your first attribute route, we briefly looked at the register routes in the app_start_route.config.cs file. So far, you've only had one line in that method to enable attribute routing. Now it's time to take a closer look at this method. Register routes is the central configuration point for routing. It's where traditional routes live. We are navigating into traditional routes. Let's remove the reference to attribute routing while the discussion focuses on traditional routes. Later you'll combine the two, but for now clear out the register routes method and put in a very simple traditional route. When you're done, your register routes method should look like this. Let's do this. Let's put that in. I'm going to grab this one that we put in here before. Put a comment in there, paste that back in, and now get rid of the other one. So now we've got them both in here, but the one that we did over here for our attribute routes is now commented out. All right. Rather than adding routes to the route table directly in the application start method, we move the default template code to add routes into a separate static method named register routes to make writing unit tests, which we'll talk about shortly, of your routes easier. That way, populating a local instance of the route collection with the same routes defined in global.asax.cs is easy to do. You simply write the following code within a test method. All right. Now, the author mentions here the simplest form of the map route method takes in a name and a route template for the route. The name will be discussed later. For now, the focus will be on the route template. All right. Just like with attribute routing, the route template is a pattern matching rule used to determine whether the route should handle the incoming request. So as we said, it's a mapping mechanism. The biggest difference between attribute routing and that we talked about previously and traditional routing, which we're talking about now, is how the route is linked to an action method. Traditional routing relies on name strings rather than attributes to make the link. With an attribute route on an action method, you didn't need any parameters at all for the route to work. The route attribute was placed directly on the action method, and MVC knew to run that action when the route matched. It says here, if we try to make a route request to a URL for the simple route, for a simple route, such as the one they showed up here that expects these three parameters, it says doing it this way, we'll get a 500 error. This happens because with a traditional route, there's no automatic link to either a controller or an action. You can fix this problem by being sure, or by changing the simple route to include these required parameters, as shown here on page 273. The author says, now if you make a request, such as /home/index, MVC will see this as a request for a controller named home and an action named index. By convention, MVC appends controller to the value of the controller parameter and attempts to locate a type of that name. Notice it's case insensitive. For route values here, the controller and action parameters are special because they are required and map to the controller and the action name, because they aren't the only ones your route can use, or they are not the only ones your route can use. And they mention here we could add a third one here, which would specify an ID. All right, again, a lot of code in here, and this is fairly advanced stuff. The idea behind going over this is by no means to make you an expert on this, but to give you an initial exposure to it. They give you an example here, and it says, looking at some of these code samples, you can see how the URL pattern corresponds to different matching URLs. And they say, remember that unless the route somehow provides both controller and action parameters, MVC won't know which code to run for the URL. All right. So far, the calls to map route have focused on defining routes that contain a URL pattern for matching URLs. Just like with attribute routes, it turns out that the route URL is not the only factor that's taken into consideration when matching requests. Providing default values is also possible. It says, suppose that we have an action method that does not have a parameter. It says, naturally, you might want to do something like this via a call. So to make this optional, you can define it like this. So you've got the ID here, and underneath it, you say that that ID parameter is indeed optional. Now, on the other hand, as mentioned on the bottom of this page here, attribute routing would have placed this default inline. Once again, traditional routing uses a different style. And then again, it's not that one is better or worse than the other. It's does one maybe make more sense to you than the other one does. All right, let's jump up to page 277, route constraints. Sometimes it says here you need more control over your URLs than just specifying the number of path segments. All right, you can use constraints. They're useful there to allow you to apply a regular expression to a path segment. Here's an example right here. So the first route that's here has got what? A year, a month, and a day. The format of the regular expression is the same that's used by the .NET Framework's regular expression class. It's expecting a digit, 4 digits, followed by 2 digits, followed by 2 digits. All right. Starting on the bottom of page 278, combining attribute routing and traditional routing. Now that you've seen both attribute routes and traditional routes, you know, both support route templates, both support constraints, both support optional values, both support defaults. The syntax, as you could see, is different between the two, as they mentioned right there. I should mention, as I'm deleting this, that I apologize for the last tape being so long. I try to keep these around 20 minutes. I lost track of time, and the previous one was 35 minutes. All right. So as it says here, you can use either attribute routing or traditional routing, or you can use both. To use attribute routing, you need to have the following line in your register routes. And they give you an example up here. Suppose you have an existing application that uses traditional routing and you want to add a new controller to it that uses attribute routing. Well, you just put that on top, as is shown right there. Big code example on 79. All right. So on 280, choosing between these two. And the author says here, should you use attribute routes, traditional routes? Either is reasonable, but here are some suggestions. Consider traditional routes when you want centralized configuration of all routes. Consider traditional when you use custom constraint objects. Consider traditional when you have an existing working application that already is using it. On the other hand, consider attribute routes when you want to keep your routes together with your actions code, or if you're creating a new application, or if you're making massive changes to an existing application. As mentioned previously, everyone's different, and many people find using the new attribute routing to be more intuitive. So if you're just learning this stuff, you might find that you naturally navigate to that. All right. Routing in ASP.NET does not require that you name your routes, and in many cases it seems to work just fine without using names. To generate a URL, it says you simply grab a set of routes that you have lying around, hand it to the routing engine, and let the engine do its stuff. However, it says, as you'll see in this section, in some cases you can break down ambiguities about which route to be chosen, all right, by using named routes. Named routes give precise control over route selection when generating URLs. A lot of talk here, but again, the idea is when you do this is you are naming something. Okay. It says always use named routes when generating URLs. Most of the time, letting routing sort this out will give you what you want, but why take the chance? All right. All right, let's jump up to the bottom of page 282, MVC Areas. And it says here, areas, which were introduced back in ASP.NET MVC2, allow you to divide your models, views, and controllers into separate functional sections, meaning that you can separate larger or more complex sites into sections. And think about this. It's not exactly the same thing. But, back in 4th, 5th grade or whatever, you started to probably write outlines where, you went from general to specific, but you took stuff up and you quartered it off, or whatever you want to say. You broke things into logical sections, and that's what they're talking about right here. Area route registration. You configure area routes by creating classes for each area that derive from the area registration class. You override the area name and the register area members. In the default project templates for ASP.NET MVC, there's a call to the area registration.register all areas within application start. If you have two controllers with the same name, one within an area and one within the root of the application, you might run into an exception with a very verbose error, such as the one shown here. When you use the add area dialog, to add an area, the route is registered for that area with a namespace for that area. This ensures that only controllers within that area will match the route for that area. Namespaces, as mentioned right here, are used to narrow down the set of controllers used when matching a route. But it's still possible to come up with ambiguity. All right. The bottom of page 284, near the very bottom of the page, catch-all parameter. A catch-all parameter allows for a route to match part of a URL with an arbitrary number of segments. The value put in the parameter is the rest of the URL path. It excludes the query string, if any. It's permitted only as the last segment of the route template. As it says here on the bottom of the page, it says, for example, The following traditional route below would handle requests like those shown in Table 9.4. So this would handle anything like this. Okay? All right. Let's finish this little subsection up here. Multiple route parameters in a segment. As mentioned earlier, it says here a route URL may have multiple parameters per segment. Here are some examples. To avoid ambiguity, parameters cannot be adjacent. So here we have the hyphen or an and or a period. Here we're trying to run them together. When a request comes in, routing matches literals in the route URL exactly. Route parameters are matched greedily, which has the same connotation as it does with a regular expression, meaning the route tries to match as much text as possible. All right, so they give you some ones that actually would work here on the bottom of page 285. Stop handling and handler and ignore routes. Top of page 286. By default, routing ignores requests that map to physical files on disk. That is why requests for files such as CSS, JPEG, and JS files are ignored by routing and handled in the normal manner. However, in some situations, there are requests that don't map to a file on disk that you don't want routing to handle. One way to ensure that the routing ignores such requests is to use the stop routing handler. Such as shown right there. Debugging routes on the bottom of page 287 and going on to page 288. Debugging problems with routing used to be really frustrating because routes are resolved by ASP.NET's internal route processing logic beyond the reach of Visual Studio breakpoints. A bug in routes can break an application because it invokes either an incorrect controller action or no controller action at all. And you may not even get an error that talks about it. So what you'll want to do is you want to make sure that you take the routing debugger and enable it. And as mentioned here on the middle of page 287, as long as the routing debugger is enabled, it will display the route data pulled from the current request URL in the address bar. All right, we're working our way towards the end of the chapter, but rather than starting now on inside routing, how routes generate URLs, I'm going to stop right now and continue that in the next lecture.